My name is Jaroslaw Martyniuk. I was born in Ukraine, but I grew up in the United States. My family ended up in a DP camp in Regensburg, Germany after World War II. And in 1949, we immigrated. So I spent the next 30 years in Chicago, where I got my education, family, and all the usual things. And then in 1979, I was working in the energy area, specifically for Amoco Oil. I was offered a possibility to move to Paris. So I lived in Paris for almost 12 years, working for the OECD in the energy area, and then switching to Radio Liberty research. This is a very brief summary of my life, so you know where I'm coming from, basically. And after that, I lived in Munich for 5 years, and since 1995, I've been living here in Washington, working as a sociologist, doing media research, specifically in the former Soviet Union. 2 years ago, I retired, and I've had a lot of time to devote to one of my favorite causes, which is a crusade against anti-communism. And this idea arose after I met my uncle, a Kolyma survivor. I met him roughly 15 years ago, 1997, in Crimea. And he told me the story of his years in Kolyma. And as you know, Kolyma survivors are about as rare as survivors of Auschwitz or some of the German concentration camps. And in that sense, I became involved in uncovering the past history, past history. And this one thing led me to another, but let me switch gears now and tell you about an event that took place last week only in an institution called Judicial Watch. I attended a symposium that commemorated the 80th anniversary of recognition of Soviet Union by the United States. This was one of the most greatest political mistakes that the United States has ever made, because at that time communism was just coming into its own, showing its real complexion. For example, the United States recognized the Soviet Union on November 16, 1933, 80 years ago. This is the ending date of the Ukrainian Holodomor, the Ukrainian genocide famine, which took place lasted from 1932 to 33, but actually began in 1929 when Stalin decided to collectivize agriculture in Ukraine. Well, as is well known, anywhere between 4 to 6, maybe as high as 10 million people were starved to death. And I would say 90% of the victims were Ukrainians, even the ones living in Russia, in the area of Kuban. The Kuban area was largely ethnic Ukrainian speaking. The only exception to this genocide were the Kazakhs, where roughly 1 million perished in Kazakhstan. All the rest were Ukrainians. There was no starvation in Russia, in the northern part of Russia. This was one of the most heinous, horrible, atrocious acts in the history of mankind, And amazingly, this event was suppressed not only by Stalin, but by people in the West who were fellow travelers and believers in communism. And this lasted for a very long time, and it began with the famous denial of a famine in Ukraine by Walter Duranty, a New York Times correspondent, who reported and wrote, "There is no famine in Ukraine. There was some bad crops," and in the end he concluded, you can't build. You can't have an omelet without breaking an egg. So to him, 6 million Ukrainians dead were broken eggs. And of course, this was believed in the West because in some ways they wanted to believe in that new paradise. Another incident, reason for example, I'll give you how deceived the West was. One of the ambassadors to the Soviet Union, Davies, witnessed the 1938 purge trials in Moscow, and he reported to Roosevelt that the trials were fairly conducted. He saw nothing wrong with the way the trials were conducted. Today, of course, we know better. I will tell you a few more pieces. Of course, I, coming from Western Ukraine, Western Ukrainians did not suffer from this Holodomor, this genocide, because they were part of Poland. The Holodomor, which is the Ukrainian equivalent of death by starvation. This is the literal translation. When the Ukrainians wanted to talk about this later on. Let me get back to this. The fact that we were in Western Ukraine, we were exempt from this Holodomor. But nevertheless, we heard of the starvation because people sometimes crossed over, and there was some information leaking. The famous British journalist Gareth Jones actually reported on this, but he was immediately vilified, pilloried, as inventing stories that were not true. The Holodomor was silenced for about 50 to 60 years. After World War II, I remember as a young boy hearing horrible stories in Regensburg, Germany, where we were in the DP camp, of people, of the horrible starvation and the millions of dead. But these were only rumors. There was no documentary evidence. But slowly the story was seeped out from the Soviet Union. There were many survivors of this atrocity, and I want to recollect for you one interesting episode. In 1961, I was in my third year at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana. And I was studying accounting and economics, and one of the courses I wanted to take is a course on Soviet economy. And one of the chapters there we covered collectivization. And of course, to me, collectivization of Ukrainian agriculture had a different meaning. Well, of course, the book didn't say anything about the starvation, but I wrote a paper as best I could, documenting the starvation genocide. And when the professor looked at this, he told me I'm inventing stories. This is already almost 30 years after the event. Even people with professors at economics, professor of Soviet economics, was not aware of this event. The Ukrainian community, though, plowed, and then eventually a lot of scholarship surfaced, and the truth came out. But I want to recollect for you another interesting story, how the story of the Holodomor was suppressed in Ukraine. When I was living in Paris, I had a number of Ukrainian artist friends who came from the Ukraine, and I got to know a very good artist called Volodymyr Makarenko. He was from Dnipropetrovsk. He, one way or another, he managed to get out of this Ukraine. That's another long story, but I recall having him over for dinner one day with our Western friends, and we were talking about the Ukrainian genocide, the Holodomor. And it seems like he didn't know anything about this. I said, Makar, can you tell us what people thought of the Holodomor? And he said, you know what? We didn't know anything. Yes, when I was growing up, after the war, I was a teenage, and I heard stories of horrible things taking place in the 30s in Ukraine. People, So my mother didn't want to talk about it. She was a Russophile woman, but so I went to my grandmother, my babunya, he called her, and he asked her, Babunyo, tell me what happened in the 30s. And Babunya, she turned at him with fear, put her mouth around his mouth. He says, don't ever bring up the topic because we will be dead or sent to Siberia. This illustrated perfectly how the fear of even mentioning the topic would have been condemned. This event that took place on November 15th, just a week ago, commemorated this recognition of the Soviet Union just at the point where Stalin had committed his most vicious, horrible atrocity of starving Ukrainians to death. This was a genocide in a real sense. In the West, for a long time, there was a reluctance to accept these facts. There was particular reluctance by scholars, by Sovietologists and experts, to refer to this event as a genocide, like the genocide, Armenian genocide, like the Rwandan genocide, because they thought the explanation was, this was always it was an unintended consequence of collectivization, but there was no real intent to kill Ukrainian people. In fact, documents are coming out today. I'll now cite one thing for my friend Roman Serbin, who's a professor at the University of Montreal, a specialist in the Holodomor. He came across an amazing piece of evidence from a Polish Jewish historian called Raphael Lemkin. In the 30s, or sometime around the war, Raphael Lemkin he actually coined the word genocide. Before that time, genocide was never used as a word in English language. And when he wrote about this genocide, what he had in mind the Ukrainian genocide, specifically the Ukrainian genocide. This document was sort of lost to history, and in the 1947, 48, I'm not sure, but late 40s, the question of the Ukrainian starvation had come up, and there was a proposition to call this a genocide. Then it was never eventually decided to call it a genocide because the Soviet Union, with Stalin at that time, said, "Niet, this is not going to be this way." So this was just an event in history of Ukraine that was passed over and hidden up until, I would say, 70s, 80s. In the 80s, more facts started to come out, and I recall a Ukrainian documentary filmmaker in Montreal decided to make a film about the Holodomor, and he put together interviews, whatever photos were available, film clips, and he decided to try to sell this to the networks as a documentary, as a good piece. It was an excellent documentary. All the American networks turned him down. That's how deep the denial was. Even I'm talking about mid-1980s, until only one person managed to show it. This was William F. Buckley on one of his shows, The Crossfire at that time, I believe, decided to show the whole film. This filmmaker's name is Luhovy, and at that time I was living in Paris, and Luhovy and his friend Yuri Derevich sent me a French version of this film, and asked me if I could contact somebody in the French cinema. I went through all the channels trying to do the same thing, and I got the same answer, no. So that's the reason why the West knows very little until recently about the Holodomor. And finally, to conclude, I can say that there are two books written about the Holodomor: Robert Conquest's Harvest of Sorrow, and now there are other works, but now the definitive work will be written by Anne Applebaum, author of Gulag. Thank you.